Hi there. Welcome everyone to this session about South Asians living with HIV and the whole South Asian HIV/AIDS sphere from in the UK and in India. Now, this is a really important event. It's rare that we see on screen a group of such esteemed professionals come in together to talk about this subject. I don't know of many other cases. And I think it's important for us to be really speaking about these issues, firstly, so people know that it's a real issue. And by having an event like this, the seriousness of this event becomes much more obvious to people who are viewing it. Also, so we can all learn about HIV/AIDS, how it affects South Asian communities around the world, and especially in the UK today, and how we can move forward to stop AIDS deaths in the UK and around the world and end the stigma, which is so prevalent. So I'd like to introduce our guests, and I've decided to go in alphabetical order. So if I get your names wrong, please do come in and just correct it. Okay, so Dr. Rajesh Darivan is a consultant physician and has been working in sexual health and HIV medicine at Bart's NHS Trust in East London since 2008. Her research and advocacy focuses on reducing health inequalities for minoritized communities, particularly women of colour. She co-founded Saha co-running this event with AIDS Memory UK, and Rajesh set it up. So thank you for that. She, as I said, she co-founded Saha, which is a South Asia advisory resource. She recently led on the first research focusing on South Asians living with HIV since 2004. That's going to be very interesting to hear about that. Mina is an international speaker, author, and transformational wellbeing coach. Mina is a certified MHFA, mental health first aid certificate or whatever, hypnotherapist, oh wow, okay, and mindfulness practitioner. She's a woman living with HIV and an HIV volunteer peer mentor. She's a member of Saha and has been involved in a number of HIV campaigns and has a background in social work and career spanning the health and social care sector. She's got a lot of experience, but on top of that, she holds a degree in neuroscience and a master's in CSR, corporate social responsibility. I don't know what that is. I look forward to hearing what that is. Indira Malik is a junior doctor working in East London. She's published research on South Asians living with HIV, which we will hear about in a presentation, and adolescents and young adults who have grown up with HIV. She's passionate about health equality and serves on the advisory board of Saha. Dr. Surinder Singh, who I first met in 1989, and he was part of the film that we're going to show soon. He's a senior lecturer at UCL and a GP with a long-standing interest in HIV and AIDS. He has been a senior partner in a thriving practice in Deptford, London since 1992. He was a member of the original independent advisory group on sexual health and HIV, established in 2002 as part of the government's national strategy for sexual health and HIV in England. Latterly, he has been a performance assessor for the GMC. Surinder is an enthusiastic advocate of point-of-care testing for HIV. That's really important. He's a GP, and we need to really talk about GPs testing. In the late 1980s, when I met Surinder, he was the principal medical officer at the London Lighthouse, which was an HIV end care and respite centre, and a very important place in the UK it was too. Gauri Vijay Kumar is an assistant professor of sociology and women's gender and sexuality studies, affiliated with the South Asian Studies program at Brandeis University. I hope I got that right. A recently published book, At Risk, Indian Sexual Politics and the Global AIDS Crisis, traces the politics of the AIDS pandemic and the relationship amongst activists, donors, and state officials that make up the AIDS response. At Brandeis, she teaches courses on gender, sexuality, globalization, HIV/AIDS, politics, and social movements. Shamal Varish is a British South Asian Muslim living with HIV and works as a senior peer support worker for Central and North West London NHS Trust. Shamal is also co-founder of Sahar and South Asian HIV Advisory Resource Network. I'm sure in the future what they're going to have is a little thing you put in each other's heads, and then we just download it so we can all just get everyone's brain into our own brain, and life will be so much easier. Okay, so I've got the little thing here telling me what we're going to be doing. So 7:30, 7:40, the chair welcomes everyone. Welcome everyone. I'm really pleased that you're here with us. And at 7:40, oh, that's soon, we're going to show the film, which was Our People, made in 1989. That's a long time ago. 32 years ago. It was released in 1990, won a British Medical Association award. It was the first film of its kind, geared towards Black and brown people in the UK. Surprisingly, the film sold worldwide. It was dubbed in 7 languages, including Cantonese, Bengali, Hindi, Gujarati, Urdu, you name it. And it sold, I mean, all over the world. It was used a lot in India, Gauri. So that was very interesting, because when I went to India, I was sent by the Elton John AIDS Foundation to assess a lot of projects in India. And then some people wanted to show me a film, and it was my film. So I was really proud of that. So we'll show a little bit of that. Let's go ahead with that straight away.
You want to know how I felt when I found out I was HIV positive. I had no idea what HIV was, nor AIDS. And no matter how carefully the doctor explained everything, I just kept thinking I was going to die. Even when I thought I understood what the virus was, I couldn't understand how I could have got such a thing. I spent hours telling the health advisor all about myself, my way of life, and when I finished, it seemed the only way I could have contracted it was from Kannu. But Kannu was my husband. He loved me. But it was the only way. That's when I got angry. The acceptance came later, much later. Not just the acceptance of myself as HIV positive, but also of what Kannu had done. For a long time, I saw the doctor almost every day. She was wonderful, and so was the health advisor at the hospital. They helped me in my decision to face Kannu with the truth. He didn't want to hear me, but I told him everything I'd been feeling in the past few months, how much he'd hurt me, and how I hated to share his bed. All he could say was, it was my fault. I'd had boyfriends behind his back. He couldn't face the truth that he was HIV positive too. He wasn't even sorry, just wanted to turn everything back on me. His parents stood by him when he threw me out of the house without my children. I was beyond anger then. I felt only contempt. Trouble was, the contempt extended to myself. The doctor told me to be patient, and she was right. It took months before I was able to talk to the children on the phone. And even then, I had to lie. I had to tell them that I was looking after my sick mother in Kenya. But finally, I managed to persuade my mother-in-law to bring Mayak and Asha to meet me in the park. When I saw them, actually saw them, it was too much for me. They'd both grown. Asha had had a birthday since I'd last seen her. They ran towards me, laughing. And as I held them tight, I started to cry. They began crying. Even my mother-in-law began crying. We held each other, the three of us, for a very, very long time. Asha said, "Mummy, please don't ever, ever go away again." I looked down at her face, and then, without thinking, I scooped her and Mayak into my arms and I ran. I just ran to my car. I don't know where I found the strength, but I did. My heart was pounding right till the moment I got them into my flat. All that seems a long time ago. Today, I have a job and I moved to another flat. Tanu doesn't know where I am, nor does most of my family. feel safer that way. Of course, Nayak and Asha do miss their father, but they understand that he's with his parents and they belong with me. I don't think I'll ever forgive Kannu. I keep hoping a cure will be found while I'm still healthy. But I have my life and my children's lives to care for. And as far as it's possible, I'm happy.
That was a little part of the film. Snegupta was very well known at the time. You may recognise her from things like Doctor Who, or she was in Octopussy and various movies. The reason we had to have actors was it was just too unsafe for people living with HIV in 1989 to appear on screen, because the stigma was so enormous that people would be thrown out of homes. The family and friends and neighbours didn't want them living near them or wanted to know them, or they'll be verbally or physically abused. So that's why we did a whole load of interviews, and this was kind of verbatim from a number of interviews to get these stories. The sad thing is, which we will hear, Sneha's story, which she recites, is a very common story today, 32 years later. It's still happening. So what's very sad about this is that I was hoping that when we made this film, it will bring about change. It hasn't really. Okay, so from there, we're going to go to Indira, and Indira is going to do a short presentation showing the current state of HIV in South Asians globally and in the UK. Thank you, Indira.
Thank you very much, Ash. And yeah, what a moving piece of cinema and art we saw there. I'm just going to share my screen.
Indira, I'm not sure if you're frozen.
Am I back? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear. Yeah, and the slides are clear.
Okay. So I'm going to just be sharing some data, as Ash said, about South Asians living with HIV in the UK, and briefly touching on the picture globally. I'm a junior doctor working in East London at the moment. So over 3.5 million people are estimated to be living with HIV in Southeast Asia, and over 2.1 million people live with HIV in India alone. So we can kind of imagine the scale of the number of people affected and the diversity of the people affected as well. And that's going to be a kind of a touch point in the data that I'll be presenting and the stories we'll hear this evening about all the different types of people who are living with HIV and the different kind of issues that they face. As for the UK, of all the people who accessed HIV care in the UK in 2019, which is the latest data that we have, quite a small percentage, 3.6, were Asian. Unfortunately, the national statistics doesn't really differentiate between the different, between East Asians and South Asians, so we don't have a clear idea. But the reason why it is a kind of imperative that we look at the reasons that people from South Asia continuing to be diagnosed with HIV is that whilst in other ethnic groups, new diagnoses of HIV are falling, it's not falling as rapidly amongst South Asians. So over the last 5 years, whilst there's been a rapid decline of new diagnoses amongst people from a white ethnic background and Black ethnic background, this has not been the case for South Asians. And also, we know from data around sexually transmitted illnesses in general, that whilst people from all ethnic backgrounds in the UK continue to have rising numbers of STIs being diagnosed. There's been a year-on-year increase in the number of people being diagnosed from an Asian background, and the percentage change in the number of diagnoses by 100,000 population is increasing. So we can kind of confer from this that we might see a rise in the number of new diagnoses of HIV as well. And to compound that, it's not only that people from an Asian background are being diagnosed, it's that they're being diagnosed late. From national data, we know that people from an Asian background are the probability is much later than the average, and certainly later than people from a white background. I did want to note that the percentage of new HIV diagnoses at a late stage of infection, when people are immunocompromised and vulnerable to all sorts of kind of opportunistic infections, which means that they're at a higher risk of become seriously ill and dying, is higher amongst people from a Black ethnic background, but this is also true of people from an Asian background. There's been, despite all of this, there's been very little data looking specifically at the South Asian population living with HIV in the UK, probably because it is a small number of the people who access HIV care in general. And we recently, myself and Rajesh is also on this panel, published some data looking at South Asians living with HIV, and this was the first paper at this since 2004. And what we did is looked closely at 131 people, all the people who'd accessed HIV care in 2 big London trusts, and looked at their ages, when they were diagnosed, the circumstances around their diagnosis, and their HIV care. The median age was 43 of the people in our sample. 82, most of them were cis men, and 24 of the sample were women, one of whom was a trans woman. And I again want to highlight that this was a very diverse population with backgrounds from all over the subcontinent. Most of these people were born outside of the UK, and equally most of the people were first diagnosed in the UK. There was a variety of sexual orientations, and the majority were in long-term relationships or married. There was a diversity of religious beliefs as well. What we found from our study, which replicated what the team who'd looked at a similar thing in 2004, was that heterosexual men were more likely to be diagnosed when symptomatic with HIV infection than heterosexual women or men who have sex with men, so gay men, and more MSM were diagnosed, or men who have sex with men were diagnosed through routine screening, which is obviously meant that infections were picked up earlier, that people were able to start medication earlier, and were less likely to become seriously unwell with HIV. And the sort of follow-on from being diagnosed when symptomatic were that they were diagnosed with a lower CD4 count, which is a marker of how immunosuppressed someone is, and how vulnerable they are to the infections that can really increase mortality in these patients. And what we found that heterosexual men were being diagnosed when they were much more immunosuppressed than women or men who'd had been infected with HIV through sex with men. And we found that over a third of heterosexual men in our sample had been diagnosed with an AIDS-defining illness. But the percentages were pretty high in all of the population that we looked at, indicating that people weren't, the infections weren't being picked up as early as they could have been. But the good news story from is that once people were diagnosed, people were adhering to medications, they were put on medication quickly, and we can tell from their viral count in their bloods that people were taking the medication. And we know that once someone is undetectable, that when the HIV virus can't be detected in the bloodstream, that they are not only likely to be leading a healthier life themselves, but also cannot pass it on to partners through sexual contact, which is the concept of U equals U, that when someone is undetectable, that it's also untransmittable. So yeah, and these are some of the references, very happy to kind of direct people to these if you want a closer look at them. And thank you very much. And I've just put up some of my contact details as well if you wanted to read the paper. Thank you.
Great, that was excellent, Indira. Really, really, really informative, sharp, interesting. Thank you very much indeed. It asks a lot of questions, and what I'm going to do is go straight to Rajesh. The reason being, I feel that we need to speak about what's happening now in HIV today. And then I'd like to go to Surinder, and we can have a conversation about what it was like 20 years ago when we made the film. So, Rajesh, please, everyone's going to speak for about 8 minutes.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you, Indira, for presenting those stats so well. And it was so interesting to see the film. And as Ash said, there's lots of things that haven't changed, but I think we really need to talk about is the fact that lots of things have changed and HIV treatment and care has really advanced since 1989. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. So I'm an HIV doctor working in East London since 2008, and I'm based in Whitechapel in East London. And I feel really lucky to have worked in a time of effective HIV treatment. So we didn't have this till 1997. So until then, HIV and AIDS was a terminal diagnosis, and it really no longer is. We know that if people are diagnosed early, before the virus has had a chance to damage the immune system, then life expectancy is virtually the same as the general population. It's now a treatable chronic condition, and people just need to take 1 or 2 tablets a day, just like many other chronic conditions like diabetes or high blood pressure. And because of treatment, as Indira said, people can no longer pass on HIV onto others, even through unprotected sex. And women will not pass HIV onto their children. So it really is possible to live a long, healthy and normal life with HIV nowadays. Being based in East London, I think I've had the privilege of treating and caring for many South Asians living with or affected by HIV over the years. And it's really important to reiterate what Indira said, that Asians living with HIV in the UK are diverse. So in clinic, I see women, I see men who are heterosexual, I see men who would call themselves gay or bisexual, and other men who are having sex with men, but who would not call themselves gay or bisexual. I see people in their 20s, I see people as old as in their 80s, and some aren't religious, some are, and if they are Muslim, Hindu, Christian. Some are working class, some are middle class, and some are born abroad, but many are born in the UK. So really HIV can affect anyone. But I think what links many of these different groups is the difficulty they have in being able to talk about their HIV status with their families and their loved ones. The stigma can be huge and can lead to profound loneliness, isolation, and mental health issues. So while I've said it's possible to live a long, healthy and normal life with HIV, the one thing that hasn't changed so much since the 1980s is stigma and discrimination, both from loved ones and from the wider community. And it is really that stigma and shame which put people off from testing from HIV. So we've heard from Indira that Asians are more likely to be diagnosed at a late stage, meaning the virus has had more chance to damage the immune system. And this really is the biggest risk factor for being unwell from HIV or even dying. And Asians are more likely to be diagnosed at a late stage than many other ethnic groups. And recent research from the National AIDS Trust, which was just released last week, looking at public attitudes to HIV and knowledge around HIV, actually showed that in the UK, South Asians had the lowest knowledge about HIV and HIV prevention, how it's transmitted and its treatment. And this means that many Asians don't think they're at risk of getting HIV. They believe HIV is an issue that affects other communities and not people like them. So HIV is just a virus. It doesn't discriminate, but we do. I think if we can tackle stigma and shame, if we can normalize talking about HIV, talking about the need to look after our sexual health just as much as any other part of our health, to be able to talk more freely about sex without shame, I think this would have a huge impact on the lives of many people in our community. So I'm going to stop there, Ash. Pass it on.
Thank you, Rajesh. We'll come back to you, actually. Surinder, can you go off mute?
Hey, I will unmute myself.
Well, we first met a long time ago. You are in the film. We'll put on the Vimeo link if anyone wants to watch it. So what was it like working at the London Lighthouse? It was a very important place in the UK, no?
I think it was important, and it really builds on or carries on the theme of what Rajesh's just been talking about, and that was the thing that was really harming people, certainly not helping, was the stigma and the shame and being shunned. And Lighthouse, in some ways, I think this was its tagline, wasn't it? It was a beacon for people. And in those days, there really wasn't very much hope. It was a, terminal illness. And that, I'd like to say one or two things about things being changed, but that was the case then. I remember the figures very clearly. If you ended up with the pneumonia associated with HIV, what used to be called pneumocystis, your prognosis was around 9 months. 9 months, okay? If you were diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma, that's the tumor associated with HIV, your prognosis was a bit better. It was about 15 to 18 months. When we were treating and looking after people in their 20s and 30s, this was a completely shocking state of affairs. Completely shocking. And I think one of the things that we did at Lighthouse is that we offered this beacon of hope, because there really wasn't very much more. Towards the end of my stay and work there, AZT was just coming on board, and there was great hope for that. But from sort of 1987, 1988, we were offering really palliative care to people of my own age then, and it was shocking, but people needed that. People needed a refuge, a safe place where actually, having been discharged from the hospital, they could at least recover something about their humanity, about their health, about, people needed to think and just have a bit of time, bit of reflection.
When did you leave the Lighthouse, Surinder?
I think it was, I've got it written down here actually, 1992.
And when did you start working there?
It was end of 89, I think. Is that right? I think that's about right, yeah.
So 3 years working in such a space where the majority of your patients that you're working with in those days, very different now, of course, were dying. Yeah. How was it as a doctor to having to deal with this?
I think the training we did as a GP, just a sort of general all round, done my training, I thought that was very good, and it sort of prepared me. What it didn't prepare me for, though, were the palliative care aspects. So, we went off. There were a couple of other doctors there. We went off and did some extra training in palliation and talking with people from hospices, people talking at the other hospice in London, Mildmay. And really, in some ways, we worked as a team, but it was difficult. It was really difficult. Emotions were very high. You add in the fact that people were very sick, and even if you got people a bit better, they recovered from pneumonia. You sort of knew there was only something else around the corner, and so getting our skills raised quickly for palliative care, end of life care, that was really our top priority. Despite all of that, and having a great team that I worked with, they worked with me. It was still quite difficult, dealing with your own age groups, people maybe 5-10 years older than you. Really quite powerful, and I'm not entirely sure I could have carried on for very much longer.
Yeah, I mean, what we don't talk about is doctors' burnout. I know a lot of doctors from that time, and some of them have had a terrible post-traumatic stress disorder, and there was not that much support for doctors and nurses. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, I think we ended up supporting ourselves, and we did that as best we could. There is this has changed, hasn't it? There is so much support available now. The BMA, there are counselling services. I myself had some coaching last year because I've sort of come up to the last 5 years of my working life. But I think we are so much better in terms of awareness around mental health issues. I mean, I've got psychiatrists, colleagues who can retire at 50, 55. And that just sort of illustrates that actually it does take its toll. Next year will be my 40th year as a practicing physician, and I don't think I'd have made it unless I sort of went into more traditional general practice. But I think to be there at the beginning with this group, to be part of London Lighthouse, to be part of this beacon, to be providing good clinical care, to be liaising with my GP colleagues and doing some work with, getting them to skill up in terms of HIV and testing and getting used to that first pandemic. I'm very proud of the work we did.
I mean, it was very important work. Talk about South Asians at that time. I mean, I know quite a few of my friends died, and one of the things that would happen, I'm not sure if you were there in the Lighthouse, when South Asians were brought in, I was asked to sometimes meet them simply because their families completely rejected them.
Yeah.
And absolutely nobody. Talk about that, because you must have dealt with such issues, and you being Indian yourself it was a surprise to me when
I think that's right. I mean, no one particularly sticks in my mind, and I'm just being very honest here. But I think we treated anyone that came in. If somebody needed help from the various services of Lighthouse, including the inpatient stay, we treated them. So we treated gay men, we treated Black women, we treated Indians, South Indians, we treated Chinese. It didn't matter, and it doesn't matter now. And that's the thing in my practice in Southeast London. The nearest school, which takes children from the people from the practice, there are 35 languages in the average classroom. I think it's no different in East London, is it, Rajeshri? That this is London. It's a completely multinational city, and what you're saying is absolutely right. I think there were special groups for South Asians. Again, I was great to be sort of part of that, but I didn't concentrate on South Asians. I was just glad to be providing what I think were first-class services as part of a team to anyone that needed it. We were a beacon. We were a lighthouse. And you know what makes me angry today, just as it did then, was people requiring care and compassion and humanity being shunned by people really who should know better.
So, I mean, that's a powerful statement, a powerful thing to say, which it's heartbreaking that people should be treated so badly. Yeah. And today
I've got patients now, Ash, that, you know, at home they're on tablets. Again, this has changed. You know, it is absolutely fantastic that we now have, you know, we reach the time where people with HIV can live a normal lifespan. And to have gone from, you know, people dying within 9 months to a normal lifespan in the generation of one set of doctors, I think is fantastic. But I was going to say, but I have patients who do take their medicine, they keep it at home, but the bottles in which they are kept are unlabeled. They are unlabeled. And the reason they're unlabeled, because obviously people around, family members, would know what their medication's for. This is 2021.
I mean, it's an appalling state of affairs. Do you see many people with HIV in your setting? And also, you said that some people come and then they just disappear and won't take their medications. Would you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm sort of less immersed in HIV now. We're an expanding practice in Southeast London. We have around, I think, again, it's sort of part. I think people got to know, you know, one's interests. So we amassed quite a lot of patients with HIV. And we've got about 70. The prevalence makes it about 0.7%, I think, of the population. And most of them, you know, are most people I know. That obviously there are new people that I don't know. They are connected with one of the big London centres. Occasionally they're connected with centres outside London, which always slightly confuses me a bit. But we do have, because I last looked at this about 5 years ago, we have patients in our practice from every single London hospital treating HIV. So again, it's very diverse. Majority of people, as far as I know, take their medication. We have a few that don't engage with care. They may do at the beginning, you know, once diagnosis has been made either by us in primary care, we refer to the local hospital or maybe to the local HIV unit. And then 6 months down the line, that unit come back to us and say, you know, this patient you referred, they have got HIV, but we've never seen them again. And we say, well, okay, well, we're going to do some digging around, and they are living at home, or people are around, and we know their children are being seen or whatever, but they're not engaging. They're not engaging. And having been, I don't know. I don't know that they are invariably non-Caucasian. That's all I can say. We don't actually look after very many Asian people. It's mostly Afro-Caribbean in our neck of the woods. I just don't know. What I do know, having been in the practice for 25 years, what I do know is that people do come back to us, but they come back to us having not engaged. They'll come back quite sick. They'll come back with the gross manifestations of AIDS, really, whether that's the pneumonia, the blindness due to cytomegalovirus, the tumor, or the brain tumors. That people can come back very sick. And so, you know, we do put a lot of effort into trying to get people to re-engage.
Rajesh, coming back to you right now, we've spoken a lot about patients coming to clinic too late to be treated. And that's a very big issue. It's continuing exactly what Surinder's talking about. And there's a lot of South Asians, which causes a problem. That's why South Asians are dying of AIDS in Britain. Do you want to say something about that? Because it's very important that people know this.
Sure. So we know that when people don't test regularly, they test when they're unwell, the HIV has had time to damage their immune system. So they have what is called a late diagnosis. So when I think about the people we see on the wards, and we do still see people with AIDS-defining diseases like the ones that Surinder's just talked about, they tend to be people who have been diagnosed late. They never thought they could have HIV, haven't accessed testing, and so they're admitted with AIDS-defining diseases. The other people we see on the wards are people who are no longer in care, and they do tend to be people from racially minoritized communities. And it's often because they face a lot of structural barriers to accessing care, as well as facing much stigma, which means they may disengage. So it's a mixture of things. So that's why I just really think testing is so important for everyone to know their status. And if we can combat kind of stigma and shame, it helps people stay in care.
So how can we get GPs to test? Because a lot of South Asian GPs aren't going to consider that their patients are going to have HIV. And there's also a lot of prejudice and a lot of stigma amongst doctors. What do you both say about that? How do we get over this issue and this problem?
So that we have very good British HIV Association testing guidelines, which talk about specific times when people should be offered tests in primary care and in hospitals. And I think we just really need to have a high variety of ways in which people can test, because lots of people don't go to sexual health clinics. They're not going to access HIV charities to get their test. They're going to attend their GP, and they should be offered an opt-out test if they're in an area where there's more HIV. When they're attending A&E for whatever illness, they should be offered an opt-out HIV testing. They should be educated about home testing. So we just need a diverse number of ways, I think, for people.
Surinder, are we at a stage where it's opt-out then? So if people go for their blood test, would they be tested for HIV? Is it mandatory, or should it become mandatory?
Opt-in, opt-out always confuses me. I think having done a lot of work at the Royal College of GPs, I think people, even GPs, actually know about, I think, the BEVA guidelines. We've worked really hard with GPs, and there is now a new generation. There's a new generation where HIV is not such a big thing anymore in terms of testing. It's become what we call normalized, and we've been trying to do this for the past 25 years. I suspect it's not everywhere, but new patients registering in general practice should be offered an HIV test if they're going to have a blood test done. And the people I see who are homeless, I invariably do hepatitis, HIV, as well as routine testing. Can I say that happens in every single practice? I'm not sure I can, but the more normal it becomes, the better. Because the key to this is testing, and I agree with what Rajesh has just said.
Surinder, thank you very much. I mean, I could still see your passion for HIV, and your career is extraordinary. We'll come back to you.
It does come out at times.
I'm glad to hear it. So, Surinder, thank you very much. Rajesh, thank you very much as well. Everyone at home, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions. So let's talk about this. Let's find a way forward. Thank you, both of you. We're going to go to Mina next. Mina is living with HIV. She's going to talk about her experiences and hopes for the future, including positive messages of U equals U. She'll explain what that is, and talk about families' emotional well-being, peer mentoring, and access to support. I've got a couple of questions already, but I'll ask you afterwards. Mina,
it's interesting. Sorry, Ash, it was interesting because I was late diagnosed as well through my but not through my GP, because they saw unusual white blood cells. But it was 6 months afterwards, and then I had a very late diagnosis and immediately acquired the AIDS kind of symptoms. So it's quite interesting that at that point, 18 years ago, it still wasn't being picked up by primary care. I'm hoping that is, that through blood tests, and early stage the GP can pick it up. But I think the thing is also is who is the right person to tell, because there's a lot of emotional trauma and impact that can have in terms of telling somebody that they've been diagnosed, and how that will impact them, like it did for me and many other people living with HIV. So my background, living with HIV, but also I think being a peer mentor, the biggest things that really coming up for people that I've supported as well as myself has been an issue around profound sense of isolation that they experience, and actually that's across race and culture and gender, as well as South Asian communities, and also mental health and emotional trauma of being diagnosed. And it almost feels like bereavement when they feel like there's a, they lost their identity, and they can, and it's a sense of bereavement and loss, and it's also the acceptance of a long-term condition. But I think once that information is given around, the treatment and the support, and also around, and so I think the key thing really here is there is that individual's internalized stigma around, the negative sort of judgments and perceptions and attitudes they also have held, which then are perpetuated within, about, themselves, but also the external shame and stigma that's held in communities about why they're not often able to share their status openly. So, for example, if you have a long-term condition, maybe, like maybe whether it's diabetes or cancer or MS, people can say that without any shame or stigma, because obviously this is an STI, isn't it? So I think that often there is all that kind of taboo and secrecy that's sort of underlined by having an STI. And I think going back to, and that in itself can then stop people from actually accessing the right support, often because they have their own internalized stigma as well that they're dealing with. And so I think often when it comes to the news story, like like yourself, Rajeshri, you were saying, as well as you, Surinder, that there's a new story, there's a new narrative around HIV. You can live a good quality of life, like myself. I'm popping 1 pill a day, which is no big deal. And if you think about somebody who's maybe got diabetes, for example, some of them some individuals with diabetes have to inject maybe, and that's more invasive often, and so if you think of the grand scheme of thing, if you are able to adhere to your treatment, you can, the fact that the U equals U, which is all about, this international campaign that not a lot of people know about, but it's really the fact that the antiretroviral drugs that people living with HIV have, it actually reduces the amount of the virus in your blood, that it becomes undetectable. So what that means is that it's so low that you can't pass it on to anybody, so you're not infectious. So I think the biggest issue is also about the individual educating themselves with being diagnosed around some of that information. Often that's not available, but making sure that's happening. But also about knowing that there is effective treatment. You can have a good quality of life, like, and get the support that you need. And I think the support does vary between the UK, between London and outskirts of London. I think and so I think there's a challenge why there is still so much isolation. And so, as a peer mentor myself, with Positively UK, I think peer mentoring and peer support is really important. So peer support really is about somebody like myself and others who live with HIV are supporting others who can support them through that journey because they've been through it, and so they can resonate more easily and help them through that emotional journey. That makes sense. Yeah. So I think that's really important, because peer support can it offers that kind of safe space and a listening ear for that person, which is non-judgmental, and it enables that person to really, talk about, telling someone, going through their own emotional journey and resonating and saying how they can help, around treatment and support, and give them information and guidance, and also signpost them to support services that they might need around different areas of their life, whether it's to do with relationships. So I'll give you an example, actually. Some of the women I've supported. I remember was one lady who came to me when I was peer mentoring her, and she came with tears, and she goes, "Oh, Mina, my life is over. I'm never going to get married, never going to have kids. Who's ever going to love me and accept me?" Because I think there's a lot of issues around, lack of confidence, disempowerment, and lack of self-worth and value of self, that comes about. And so, and it's really weird, because after I did her 12 sessions, this is few years ago now, she rang me one day out of the blue, and she goes, "Mina," she goes, "guess what? I'm getting married to a guy who's HIV negative." And she's had children since then. so women can, men and women can have families, have meaningful relationships. And I know so many women, including myself, who've had meaningful relationships, good relationships, and have married, and so it's not that you cannot have relationships, and it doesn't happen, because it does. And I think attitudes are shifting. I think, and I think it's also, and it's, I suppose we get rejected for all kinds of reasons, but I think that it is about attitudes and perceptions which need to change. And I think, as you said, Ash, that old narrative of the 80s that it was a death sentence doesn't exist anymore. I think, and I think alongside with peer mentoring and peer support is really important. But what I would like to say also is there is still, that I think, your reference to the fast track report about knowledge and around public knowledge and attitude. What was interesting that came out of that was also the lack of training still for HIV health professionals. But also for me, I think that one of the issues I'm picking up, from having worked in the health and social care sector, is there isn't specific support targeted and services for people from the South Asian community. And I think that needs to be stepped up personally, I think, actually, because initially, because the rates within African Caribbean communities and the LGBT community was higher, historically services were very much targeted for that target group, population of patients. And I think that now it's interesting, with Indira's sharing her, the recent statistics around, the increased rates of STIs and HIV in the South Asian community, that there needs to be more kind of understanding about why that's happening, but also understanding the sort of cultural barriers that people with South Asian communities have, and about sharing their status, but how we can offer a safe space to ensure that they are able to engage and get the support, the emotional support, as well as the practical support that they need through peer mentoring and services that actually target those communities who are disengaging, which you said, Surinder, because people are disengaging and you can't just leave them, and I think it's important that that is more focused and targeted. So I think there is so the story has changed. I'm here to tell it. I've got my blonde hair, but what I'm saying, my red lipstick, but what I'm saying is, you can lead a normal life and it's great and it's okay. But I think it takes courage, for sure.
Mina, that's really brilliant. That's very inspirational. I think you're a warrior. And can you speak a little bit about HIV stigma, the effects HIV stigma has on the individual living with HIV? What exactly does it do to a person?
Well, I think it just stops the person from actually accessing support for their emotional health, their mental well-being, because they're just totally isolated. And I think there needs to be, I think there's at a point of care, when they're diagnosed, whether it's in a clinical or gum clinic, I think it's really important that the person is accessing peer support of some sort. So they know that they're not alone. There are other people who's living with HIV and it's going to be okay. Because often there's an emotional journey they're going through. It's almost like bereavement. It's a sense of profound loss, and they have an identity crisis like most people living with HIV do initially do, and then you get newly diagnosed because they see the label, they don't see themselves, they almost lose themselves, they forget who they are. So often they need counseling support or peer mentoring just to talk through that emotional journey of how they're feeling about it, and then demystifying some of those myths and fears that they may have about living with HIV, and saying that actually it's not all okay, it's okay. You know what I mean? It's going to be okay. And it is going to be okay.
I mean, I think it's particularly interesting when you talk about the self-stigmatization of the individual. I mean, we see that very much, that's very common in the LGBT communities. I've also said that, a lot of people who are fighting certain issues themselves have HIV prejudice. I have had lots of cases of people, when people are talking about anti-racism or themselves very racist. We don't talk about this enough, but let's talk about, I want us to later on really talk a bit more about HIV stigma, because I think HIV stigma is like racism. You can talk about racism as much as we're going to talk about racism. It doesn't mean it's going to go away, because it's a building block of many different issues which need to be broken down individually, I believe.
But Ash, can I just say something towards that, if you don't mind, around stigma? Is often one of the things I think somebody who's living with any kind of condition, you know, whether it's a physical disability or a health disability or a health issue in long term, is one of the things you have to come to terms with is people will always have an opinion about everything, you know, about your status, and you can't control that. So, you know, it is a journey of self-acceptance and self-love, and I think that's what it's taught me, actually. And you know, and that's what I teach, because I think you've got to have self-compassion and kindness to yourself, because you know, you can be that critical voice that, you know, and have those narratives that I'm dirty or I'm this or I'm that or whatever, and you can have shame and guilt and anger, and I think that doesn't help, actually. And I think often it's enabling that person to self-accept that you're okay. You know, it's not the whole, it's only a small part of your life, actually. It's not the biggest part of your life anymore, because like you say, the treatment is amazing. I can do anything. I'm physically healthy, I'm great, I'm well. You know, there are other people with more disabling conditions, actually, you know, out there, like arthritis or kind of all right. So I think it's sharing, it's about telling a different story, that HIV has changed so much. You can lead a very good quality normal life and just be you, you know, and often it's the emotional support that the individual needs around their own internalized stigma and shame and guilt that they're holding, or the fear of being judged by others. And I think often through my emotional resilience training work that I do, you know, as a life coach and well-being coach, is I support people through that emotional journey, about allowing them to say that it's normal to feel what you feel, but actually you've got to, you know, it's about getting to a better feeling place, you know, and being kind and loving, compassionate to yourself.
Thank you, Mina. That's brilliant. Really, really, really excellent. And we'll be speaking more. Save your questions, and please do come back, those viewing at home. Gary, I just muted myself. Now, I really love the title of your book, Indian Sexual Politics and the Global AIDS Crisis, including the effect of the AIDS epidemic on sexual identity. Two things I'm really interested in, that is Indian sexual politics and AIDS epidemic on sexual identity. I look forward to hearing what you say.
Thank you so much for having me. Apologies in advance. There's some children in the background who are doing some loud singing. So I am so honored to be here, and thank you so much to Rajeshri and Ash and everybody who put so much work into organizing this. And I really just wish I could hear all of you, because you have so much vital experience and knowledge and wisdom. So I'm not a physician, I'm a sociologist, and so my approach in my book is to really think about AIDS as a problem of politics, right? So, you know, in the book, I look at AIDS as really about, you know, how the state considers some forms of sexuality acceptable and other forms of sexuality worthy of repression or violence. And in that context, activism becomes really crucial, right? And in India, activism was very crucial to AIDS being managed and to, you know, doing life-saving work in marginalized communities. So I focus specifically on the groups that were categorized as most at risk of HIV, and there are many terms used to describe these groups at different times, but the title of my book is At Risk, which is one of the most common terms used to describe sex workers, sexual minorities, men who have sex with men, lots of different vernacular terms people use, like koti, double-decker, bisexual and lesbian are some of the more kind of globally resonant terms, and transgender people, including hijras, Arabanis, etc. And looking at how HIV programs and activism changed their lives. So part of the premise of my book is that, you know, because AIDS attracted so much attention to these groups because they were marked as at risk, it affected their lives whether or not they directly encountered HIV. It sort of changed the way sexuality was thought about and regulated in India. And that meant that HIV played a lot of different roles. So in some ways, it increased the stigma and violence against these groups. And in other ways, it became a catalyst for them to organize. So one of the roles I hope my book plays, you know, I see kind of activists as really leading the way, and I really kind of think of myself as somebody who's learning from and documenting and archiving some of this brilliant work. So, From the very beginning of the AIDS pandemic in India, the question of whether AIDS even was going to be a crisis in India was kind of a matter of debate. So, and I'm sure many of you remember this, right? There were some who argued that India was going to be the next epicenter of the epidemic. And people said, it's going to go the way of Africa. There are going to be 20 million people with HIV. These were quite explosive predictions. And on the other hand, there were people who said AIDS is a hoax. It's only a problem that affects the West. The West has homosexuality. The West has these kind of permissive sexual cultures, but India is this place with strong family values, monogamous marriages, morally virtuous people, and there's only some groups that are at risk, but not the rest of us, right? So this was kind of one of the debates early on. And what this meant was that the state really repressed the groups that were considered to be sort of a threat to this morally virtuous nation, right? So for example, in Tamil Nadu, early on in the epidemic, medical authorities detained some 800 sex workers for mandatory testing. They were confined. They were left with limited food and access to medical care. They were cut off from their families. There were women who died in confinement. There was an African student who was found to be HIV positive, and then the Ministry of Health announced that AIDS testing was compulsory for all foreign students who wanted to come to Indian universities, and they started deporting African students because Africans were also considered to be another risk group. And African students actually protested these guidelines and boycotted the test. There was a protest march in Delhi of African students in 1987. Another really important example is the experience of Dominic D'Souza, who was a gay man who was confined, and he actually didn't even know he had HIV until he overheard some nurses talking about it behind the door. He was confined, separated from his family. So in the first part of my book, I talk about these moments of violent kind of coercive reactions to HIV. And I kind of try to argue that it was part of the Indian state's attempt to position itself as kind of virtuous, modern, and to say like AIDS is something that happens to other people. It's not part of the nation. And then the rest of my book is really trying to talk about how activists responded to this, right? So for example, in Dominic D'Souza's case, there was a lot of media attention. His village panchayat actually submitted a written statement and held a march supporting his release. His mother filed a writ petition. And as a result of that activism, the Goa Public Health Act, which was the act under which he had been detained, the High Court declared that people with HIV were no longer required to be detained in the way he had been. There was another really important public interest litigation put forward by Shamla Natraj, who was an important activist, who pushed for the release of 800 sex workers in Tamil Nadu. A really important group, the AIDS Bhedbhav Virodi Andolan, protested the 1989 AIDS prevention bill in India, which basically allowed for random mandatory blood tests of sex workers. And ABVA was a coalition of queer activists, feminist activists. Some of them had been in the US, in the UK, they were transnational. They had support from around the world through diasporic connections. They fought against some of these kind of repressive attempts. And then I talk about how later on, as a result of this activism, the state started to shift their approach and actually started to work with some of the activist groups. So activist groups started to become part of the HIV response. So I talk about many different groups: DAMP, Darbar Mahila Samanvaya Committee, Humsafar Trust, Naz Foundation, which was which was the group that put forward the challenge in the Delhi High Court to Section 377, Karnataka Sex Workers Union. So a lot of these groups sort of drew energy from the HIV response. But what they did that was really innovative was that they framed HIV within the larger context of sexual stigma, politics, poverty. So just one example of this, I interviewed one woman who was Muslim, who was a sex worker. Her husband had kicked her out of the house. She had 2 kids. At one point, she had been, nearly suicidal. And when I talked to her about HIV, she said, I have already died, right? I don't want to live. I've been abandoned by everybody who matters to me. The police have abandoned me. The state has abandoned me. My family has left me behind. So I want to die of HIV, right? And so this, I think, really captures, I think, the structural context of HIV, which is that, people are saying, I've already been killed by a society who doesn't want to include me, right? So, and then you're saying, well, now I have to prevent HIV to protect the general population, right? So this contradiction was really important. So what a lot of these activist groups did was, say, okay, well, we're going to teach people how to prevent HIV by addressing things like rapes by police officers of sex workers, or discrimination against gay people or transgender people, right? And the lack of housing, stable housing for transgender people, the criminalization of homosexuality, etc. So these were kind of the issues that activists brought to the fore. And then the other piece of this is that, and this is the sexual identity piece that Ash, you were interested in, is that working with these programs for activists was a complicated double-edged sword, right? So for a lot of the people I talked to, doing HIV peer education was their first entry point into activism. So a lot of times people who, for example, were part of a hijra community, so transgender women who were part of the hijra community, or cisgender women who did sex work on the street, didn't read or write. When they became part of HIV prevention programs, that was the first time they had a more stable salary, they had on office space, they learned all these new terms to describe their sexuality. They got access to other people. So a lot of people said, I finally found people who are like me, right? I finally found people who care about me. I built new connections, new communities, new structures of support. And so this was a really empowering sort of space in a lot of ways, a contradictory space, right? Because it's based on HIV risk, but also it created some of these new forms of resilience. But at the same time, there were also always pressures, right? So another issue I talk about was big international donors, which funded some of these HIV programs, and a lot of times really wanted to kind of deprioritize some of that vital community building work, and instead prioritized, reaching big targets, evaluation metrics, we're bringing in a lot of money, so had a lot of influence, but really cared more about kind of having a shiny donor report rather than some of these kind of structural interventions that some of these groups were involved in. And so this conflict was ongoing, right? And activists really had to fight to define HIV and respond to HIV in the way that they wanted. The last thing I'll say, and I think this, relates now to some of the situation with COVID-19 in India, is that, one of the kind of tragedies of the AIDS response in India is that many of these groups, which were really kind of at the forefront of bearing the brunt of the devastation and death and loss of HIV and AIDS, and were the ones who managed and responded to it, were largely forgotten after HIV was considered to be over, right? So now, if you look at an account of the Indian AIDS epidemic, you'll see India successfully stopped the HIV epidemic, and HIV is no longer a problem, right? And so a lot of these the people I interviewed felt forgotten after this point, right? At the height of HIV funding in India, there were hundreds of millions of dollars coming in for this activist work, for these community groups to organize. After HIV was considered to be over, one of the people I interviewed said, it's like they came and then they just left us here and we're just all alone now. And I think this has become particularly clear in the context of COVID-19, where many of these same groups, street-based sex workers, transgender people, sexual minority people, people living with HIV, they've been largely abandoned by the state, right? They don't have access to a lot of the government relief programs that exist. And it's really been some of these community groups that formed during the HIV response that have stepped up to fill the gap, right? So making sure people get ARTs, making sure people have food, making sure people have basic income assistance. So they've kind of built those community structures, even in the context of abandonment by the state, and they've kind of been able to take those resources across pandemics but largely in the context of a state that says, you only matter to us in this particular context, but now that AIDS is over, you don't matter anymore. And so this is one of the conflicts I kind of think about in my book as well. So I'll stop there.
And that's really, really fascinating and really interesting. I remember in the early days, which you did refer to, I think it was the health minister who said Indians have special blood, we can't get HIV. And what was always interesting to me in India is the activism at grassroots level, which really brought about change within India. And it was a very powerful bringing together of people and talk about sexuality. I remember being PSI in Bombay, and all the women would go out and do field work, and they'd wear saris because they found when they wore saris, the men would treat them far more respectfully. Mm-hmm. And we had gone in working with the sex workers, and my friend Eve had come from New York, and she was all blonde and beautiful, and walking through all the sex areas, and she had to be surrounded by sex workers. The guys kept trying to pinch her bottom, and they said that they use these kind of archetypes to get this communication going. Another thing is, I remember working with the sex workers who had been kidnapped from their villages at 15. Their families didn't want them, and they were HIV positive. This was pre-meds, and their kids were. And they did these wonderful puppet shows for us, and they'd make these beautiful puppets, and then they'd go out on the field teaching other sex workers, newer sex workers, about HIV and empowering them so they could speak to their clients to use condoms. So there's lots of work, there's lots of stories. I really look forward to reading your book. Can I ask you a question about HIV treatment in India? Because I understand that medication is free to all.
Yeah, that's right.
Are people accessing that medication?
Yeah, I recently looked at numbers on this, but I don't have a statistic off the top of my head. I mean, I think there is medication free to all, but there are so many barriers to accessing it, right? There's, and I think many of you have spoken to this, in the context of the work you're doing, and I think many of those issues extend to India as well, right? So, all the barriers along the way of testing, of getting medical care, getting to a clinic. So yeah, I mean, I think, and I think one of the things I've heard many activists say is that, even though drugs were available, and India has actually, produced a lot of AIDS drugs, it's like the pharmacy of the world and exporting drugs to Africa, et cetera. A lot of these kind of community distribution networks are kind of not there. And actually a lot of the AIDS response, most of it, is really focused on prevention, right? So a lot of people do sort of feel left behind and feel like, okay, well, now I have HIV and the whole system has been oriented to kind of teaching me how not to get it. And so there is a sense of, I think, less of those structures of support for people living with HIV. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, you did, because
yeah.
I mean, that is important. The important fact for people to know is that there's free medication in India for people, but there's an access issue. Yeah, but at the same time, companies do export medications to the United States, where something like 40%, I believe, of people living with HIV cannot access medication. So, HIV is not as it was all those years ago, where it was the West were doing well and the East and African countries aren't doing so well. Everything's turned around nowadays. And I think it's very important that people who are listening to this at home understand that it's far more complex where people are being treated and who can access medication. You can't access medication if you're poor, black, homeless, Latino in the United States. And we must never believe this false belief that everything's perfect in the West. People still die of AIDS in the UK. Thank you so much, Gauri. I can't wait to read your book. And I know Rajesh, I must get your name right. I keep saying it in the Gujarati way. And
Rageshri.
Yeah. You're correcting me. every time I do it. But we've known each other for so long. I think you're just used to it now. At least I'm aware of it. Anyhow, thank you, Gauri. We'll come back to you soon. And now we'll come to Shamo, and he's going to talk about lived experiences of living with HIV and working in the HIV sector, being a senior peer support worker, and hopes for the future, including messages on testing, treatment, and prevention, including PrEP. Over to you, Sham.
Thank you so much, Ash. I must start by thanking all of the panelists on the session with me today, just for sharing your experiences and your thoughts and your opinions. But a particular thank you, I know Rajesh really well, but Surinder, thank you so much for sharing what your experiences in the early part of the AIDS epidemic. I know you will have given lots of people lots of hope as they were dealing with the diagnosis, or as they were in the wards and dealing it with their family. So a couple of weeks ago, I was at the AIDS Quilts exhibition, and it was just such a moving time to just see their living what was living of the people who were affected by AIDS and are now no longer with us, and just seeing their names. So it's really, really tremendous, the work that you would have done on behalf of all of the HIV sectors. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Sham. It's appreciated. Thank you.
No worries. For me, I think one thing that I do want to kind of get across about HIV is the face of HIV today. And I want to bring some positivity to the conversation as well. To just say that somebody like me, who is British, South Asian, Muslim, is living well with HIV. And for me, I think for me and for us, for all of us to be able to get that positive message across and to be able to remove the shame and challenge those stigmas is to actually talk about it more openly. We know that HIV has been stigmatized for many, many years, for 40 years in various communities and across the society, but in particular in South Asian communities, because it is associated with sex, just a huge taboo. We don't really talk about that. So I just want to kind of just show that I'm somebody who's, living with HIV. I'm on effective treatment, reiterating what Mina said about the U equals U messaging. So I'm undetectable, which means the virus is untransmittable, and be able to kind of like talk about prevention methods as pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is a tablet that you can take called PrEP, to prevent you from getting HIV, and just kind of getting that message across that although my journey of acquiring HIV and getting diagnosed has not been easy, I'm in a space now where for me, it doesn't affect me. It doesn't reinforce any self-stigma that I have, and I don't feel ashamed to be living with HIV, and I need to get that message across, and that's what I do to empower other people, to teach them about what it is to live with HIV today and how we can work through it and come to terms with the diagnosis and live well with the virus. At Sahar, we're doing a lot of work to establish more resources and produce more resources and tools that will be targeted at the South Asian community. But I think, having now worked as a senior peer support worker and working in the NHS, I also work in a local authority and with public health. I work in a local authority in an area in a borough of London which has a largely Asian community. And sometimes I get really frustrated by the messaging that comes across when we talk about South Asians. So for quite a long time, we've been addressed as BAME, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, and as it's South Asian Heritage Month, now conversations are coming up and we're talking about South Asian. But I was last week at the National AIDS Trust HIV Knowledge webinar, and we were discussing, and they were talking about and asking us about what community means to us. And I think when we're having these conversations, we need to talk to our policymakers, our commissioners, our colleagues who are in the sector, and actually really address what do they understand is South Asian. Because when we talk about South Asian, we look at just us lot, we're looking at people from Bangladesh, India, Pakistan. Is that South Asian? That's 1.8 billion people. And if you look at that further, that's about four major religions, over 25 main languages, over 600 dialects, countless cultural identities. So what we do address, or we talk about in one, or we give any kind of health promotion or resources or tools that may be targeted at a community in Whitechapel, is not going to work for a community in West London, for instance. And we really need to kind of address that and talk about what it means to be South Asian and who are we actually talking about. And yeah, once we're working towards that, we can then start building those conversations, start openly talking about it, because our way to get to zero transmissions by 2030 of new transmissions of HIV is to be able to talk about it openly and educate our community, and get them access to resources, tools, and effective treatment, testing, and prevention methods of HIV, so that they can know their status and live well with the virus, or prevent themselves from catching it. Thank you.
Shan, that's brilliant. You took me by surprise.
All right, okay.
That was really, really, really interesting. It's important to say here that the Indian communities in this country do import their prejudices from the Indian subcontinent. So in many ways, when I can look at my mother, when her access in television, my aunts and everyone, they watch Indian soaps. They'll mainly watch Indian TV news. They may watch the occasional EastEnders, but they're accessing all their information from the Indian subcontinent, and which can sometimes be problematic. Let's open us all up to questions. I don't know how we do this, but if anyone's got a question, I don't know where you put the questions, but Thea, where do you put the questions? Oh, Miriam. Well, that was noisy. Okay, what can LGBTQ South Asian communities like GIN, it's the Gay Indian Network, which is a network in the UK, working with South Asians in London particularly, but it's moved to the Midlands and elsewhere, do to connect with closeted gay married men that are picking up HIV and STIs, often quite late, and passing them on to their wife? Can I answer this? I'm developing a film with the BFI right now, which is about this. It's heartbreaking for me that I heard these stories 32 years ago, and we put them in the film Our People, and you saw that clip earlier on, and then 32 years later, I went undercover and I did talk to quite a lot of people in East London and who were married, and they were telling me all sorts of stories, been forced into marriages and all sorts of things like that. I don't, it feels like you need drama for this, and it needs to become a national conversation for change to happen, where people can see themselves on screen, because we use cinema. We have such a relationship with cinema in the South Asian communities. Somehow you have to have that conversation through cinema for change, for the conversation to happen, so eventually bring around change. So it's a very valid point, and it just breaks my heart, really does. Anyone else got to add to that? Because Rajeshri, you work with lots of people. We've talked a lot about this.
Yeah, so I think I see a lot of those people in clinics. There are a lot of closeted men who are married to women. I see their wives as well, and often the only person their wives have had sex with is with their husbands. And I think it's an incredibly sad situation for everybody involved. And I think in terms of how can we reach those men, I think often their levels of HIV knowledge are low, their knowledge about sexual health is low, and they often tend to be people who perhaps are first generation migrants who perhaps don't have a great level of English. So they're not really accessing those HIV prevention messages in the same way as other people. So they don't go to gay clubs where there may be posters about how to get an HIV test. When they do access healthcare, it may be through their GPs who may not be routinely talking about HIV, or they may not think that they're at risk because they're not gay. So why would they need an HIV test? So I think there's something there about health promotion, around education, around health inequalities, around migrant communities in general, not just Asian ones. I think we need a really multi-pronged approach with that.
I think it also goes back to that issue, doesn't it? That actually, as a South Asian population, we're very diverse, and it's celebrating that diversity. And we're not homogeneous. And so when it comes to commissioning and targeting specific areas of communities, there is that it's got to be different approaches because of the different layers and complexity that's there. And I think it's about evidence basing some of that, and ensuring that people are and targeted, and and also it's about the outreach, isn't it? It's complex, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. I mean, there is also another. Shan, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I do actually. Just to kind of reiterate things like talking about online testing and self-testing kits. I think there's been a lot of stigma, and we know there's shame around going to a sexual health clinic or even going to your GP. A lot of times people have a GP and it's a family doctor and the entire family is with that GP practice and they don't feel comfortable talking about these things. COVID-19 has created more opportunities to access self-testing and sexual health STI testing online, and just being able to understand how discreet that is and how easy it is, and just being able to kind of get that message across in the community would be a really good thing for something like Gin to be working more on. I think they're doing a fantastic job already, but those are the messaging that we really need to get across, that there is access to self-testing and online testing and just normalizing it more. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's important. Gauri, what I found in India was a lot of the work, health education work, was happening from local communities. So, I mean, in the gay world, it was happening within like Gay Bombay and with various groups. But can you talk a little bit about similar issues in India, of how you educate the masses around issues about sexual health and HIV?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. Yeah, I mean, I've interviewed many men in India who are living with HIV and have sex with men and are married to women. And it's it's a complicated, as you've all said, a complicated situation. I think a lot of the organizations that I talk to, part of their work is actually to build in conversations with families, right? And that doesn't always mean, the marriage ends, right? Sometimes it means just talking to the family about, okay, well, what does this mean? What is HIV? What is sexuality? What are, who am I? Kind of talking about identity. So having those family conversations, educating the family, bringing them into the fold, doing this kind of, a lot of like personal connections. I talked to a lot of people who brought their families into the drop-in center to talk with the staff there about what HIV is, and to talk about sexuality and sort of help them to understand. And a lot of people do live, they live and thrive in those conditions, but it does take that kind of grassroots, I think, community-based work, as you said.
Thank you, Gauri, because we can learn from what's happening in India. Indira, have you got anything to add to this? Oh, I think Indira may have frozen. Any more questions regarding Gauri's work? Are there ways in which contemporary HIV LGBT activism is complicit in the state's ignoring of important communities and goals due to the issue being considered over? I don't quite get that. Gauri, do you understand that?
I think so. So activism being complicit. Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's a lot of people I talk to in my interviews. I would ask them, like, do you think HIV is over? Of course, this is a global debate. It's not just India. Like, in the US and in the UK, we also contend with this kind of, a narrative that HIV is over. So yeah, I mean, I think like some AIDS experts, and rightfully, they're proud of what they've done and their successes. But that also does mean, in some cases, the continued marginalization of the needs of people with HIV and of groups affected by HIV or risk of HIV or who have been part of the HIV response. So yeah, I mean, I think it depends, because there's also been very different trajectories of different groups. So I think, for example, one of the things I've talked to people about recently is that, I think transgender politics has had a different trajectory in India than sex worker politics, because after HIV was no longer considered to be an issue, there were lots of other changes happening, lots of other activism happening, and legal changes, and there have been sort of advances in transgender rights, whereas for sex workers, it hasn't looked the same way. It's actually meant after HIV was considered to be over, they were kind of like left behind, basically. And so there are, so I think there's a lot of variation across, and a lot of those same inequalities of caste and class kind of get reproduced. So the organizations that are bigger and maybe have more middle class leadership, or who are more kind of in an urban area or something, they've been able to kind of weather the shift differently than some of the more rural groups or more marginalized groups. So yeah, I think there's a lot of variation within the movements.
I mean, it's a really important question, this about AIDS being over, and some commentators talking about it, but they talk about this from a very Western perspective. Mm-hmm. And it causes huge problems for people who are still experiencing AIDS the same way that Surinder Singh experienced all those years ago. We're at 9 o'clock. Should we all sum up? Unfortunately, if there's any more questions, we can't take them. So I'm going to go to Mina first. Mina, what would you like to say as a final message for everyone listening to this?
I think just to say that, being diagnosed with HIV is not the end of the world, and the life can be fine, and it's just make sure people get the right information and support that they need. And I think for us it's about ensuring that the message goes out to South Asian communities around sexual health and sexual well-being and mental well-being, and that there is support out there for everybody, and reach out and get the help that you need, and don't suffer in silence.
Great, thank you very much, Mina. Sham, coming to you.
Thank you. Yeah, for me, I think it's just about pointing out that HIV, the cure is not important for me. It's about challenging that stigma. So we need to just make sure that we're educating ourselves on what prevention methods there are, what treatment methods there are, and what testing methods there are, and know your status. Let's normalize it for future generations. Let's be more positive when we talk about sex, and generally just be more responsible. Thank you.
Thank you, Sham. Going to Rajeshri.
Didn't know where you were going to land there. So I'm fed up of seeing people on the wards with AIDS-defining illnesses. I want everyone to get a test and know their status. I want people to know about the existence of HIV prevention. There is post-exposure prophylaxis, or PEP, which can be taken within 72 hours of possible contact with HIV. It's a course of medication you take for 28 days. It's extremely effective. You can get it from A&E or a sexual health clinic. And I just want to briefly mention PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is a tablet that you can take daily or when needed to prevent you getting HIV if you think you may be at risk, a bit like the pill. So yes, I don't want to see any more late diagnosis. Please get tested and know your status.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to finish with Gauri, but actually, let's go to Gauri and finish with Surinder. Gauri, I want to ask you a question of how can you all learn from each other around the world? You're in the United States, you work a lot in India, we're in the UK.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think, within the AIDS response, one of the things I've thought a lot about is that there have been all these global exchanges, but also, I think a lot of times what I've also seen is that, the same things don't work in every place, right? So it's really about kind of, I think the groups I've seen that have built the most effective responses and been able to address the politics and the stigma and all that we've been talking about, have built deep roots where they are, and really thought about, what are the conditions in their communities and building those structures from the ground up. So maybe that's something, we can learn from each other, but it also comes from, being where we are.
Great, thank you very much. Hopefully Sahar will be doing this and doing great work at this. It's a grassroots organisation. Surinder, a lot has changed over a relatively short time, as you said. What can GPs do to really move towards ending AIDS? We've got the tools to end AIDS worldwide with PrEP, PEP, condoms, U equals U. Where do we go from here?
I think it's having the confidence and the ability to just test. With testing, you can change somebody's life. I want to end on a positive note. We have come a hell of a long way. In my lifetime, we were literally sort of burying people following a diagnosis. We've gone from that to the majority of my patients now in practice, and it is the majority, that are absolutely fine and living their lives and all the things that Mina was saying. And, you know, with one tablet a day, one tablet. I've got other people with other long-term conditions who are affected far more than the HIV. And that is such an amazing thing. It's an amazing transformation. And I'll be the first to say it.
So with your experience, having seen the real worst effects of HIV and now seeing the best, I mean, that's a really powerful statement when you see other people who have worse effects and for their conditions compared to HIV today.
Absolutely.
What a transformation. How exciting is that?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Indira, can you hear us?
Yes, hi.
Oh, last one for you. What would you like to do? You're a junior doctor. Where would you want, and you've done loads of research, where do you want us to go from here?
I mean, first of all, I'd just like to say so honoured to be speaking with all of you. And yeah, what I think what's really jumped out to me during this conversation is that how access to treatment and testing touches on so many different aspects of society. It's not only about tackling the HIV stigma, but looking holistically at sort of, especially in the UK, sort of immigration policy of how kind of poverty, access to healthcare, language barriers can affect people accessing health for everything, which and HIV kind of is a focus of so much of that, because a lot of different kind of stigmas in society come together to affect people living with HIV, including kind of homophobia, xenophobia, in some cases poverty. So yeah, it is all about sort of kind of holistically tackling the problem and looking at it from all kind of angles.
Thank you, Indira. That's great. I want to thank South Asian Heritage Month for putting this on. It's a really important discussion. Next year, I hope we can meet and continue the conversation. To continue the conversation, which we will be doing, I'm going to be talking about something that AIDS Men UK are doing. We've got a one-person show about my family's relationship with Farooq Balsara. And for people who are in the know, they will know that that's Freddie Mercury. So that's going to be happening on the 4th of September at the Royal Vauxhall Academy in London to celebrate the unofficial 75th birthday party of Freddie Mercury. So please come along to that. Let's continue this conversation. It's so important to just keep on at it, to get the message across. As Mina said, let's normalise this conversation. Thank you very much, all of you, for speaking, taking your time. Thank you for all of you at home who've stayed. It seems that most of the listeners have stayed right to the end. And have a very good evening. Thank you, everyone.